Good evening, everyone. The roadworks on Parks Way did their level best to keep one of our speakers from getting here this evening, but he has arrived, and for that we are very grateful. So my name's Grundy. I'm a research manager at the delighted to welcome you this evening. We're all meeting here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. This country has been cared for by Ngunnawal and Ngambri people for many, many millennia, and I'm very grateful for the care that they've taken and continue to take with this place. So the Institute is one of the country's most influential public policy think tanks. Influential, but I think the organisation will try to be a bit more than that. We really appreciate all of your support, and it's predominantly monthly donors who are huge for keeping the Australian Institute running, but perhaps you're not in a position to be a monthly donor. That's we understand. There is a little device down the back that my colleague Hannah is looking after, and if you happen to be able to spare something tonight, we would greatly appreciate it. So now I can welcome our guests this evening. To my immediate left, I have Malcolm Baalman, who is a Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Public Health Association of Australia, and he has a background as a political staffer and as a consultant. Welcome, Malcolm. And we also have Reverend Tim Costello, who is Chief Advocate at the Alliance for Gambling Reform. He's a former Victorian Australian of the Year and the author of many books. I was going to say 6. Is that accurate? 7 books. Welcome, Tim. So in Australia, we've normalised having a punt, whether it's 2 Up at Australia Day or whether it's Melbourne Cup, or just before the session, I was speaking to someone in the audience about having a go on the pokies at Ainsley Football Club at lunchtime. But the culture of gambling in Australia goes much further than that. And in the financial year 22-23, Australian gambling losses were a third more than the losses in Las Vegas. So we're talking about Australia's gambling problem tonight. For those of you who read the ABC today, you would have seen Tim talking about the Northern Territory Racing and Wagering Commission. How many people have heard of the Northern Territory? Very good. We have a well-informed audience. Tim, tell us about this organisation and what their role is in Australian gambling.
Well, thank you. And let me just say, so good to be with you here tonight. As my brother, who spent a bit of time here, used to say, Canberra. Lives like Toorak, votes like Footscray. And that's why I've always liked Canberra. So the Northern Territory Racing and Wagering Commission is the de facto regulator of all the bookies in Australia. 36 of the bookies that launch the tsunami of gambling ads we see on our TV, 900 million a year on then all the social media. It's regulated by 6 people in the territory. Yes, I can hear you asking why. Because 36 of the foreign biggest Sportsbet, Ladbrokes, Bet365, 36 of them registered in the Northern Territory, paid virtually no tax for their licence, thereby making the Northern Territory Racing and Wagering Commission the de facto regulator for Australia. Today's article, which has taken some time to get up, pointed out that 3 of the 6 are all from the racing and gambling industry. All of them admitted to actually having freebies and hospitality from Sportsbet, Tabcorp, Ladbrokes. The Northern Territory gambling minister who appoints them openly admitted without a flicker of shame. Of course, I take all the freebies from Sportsbet, Tabcorp. They're the regulator. They're the regulator for the tsunami of ads. And the article today essentially was pointing out what an utter farce this is. The greatest gambling losses in the world per capita. The nation that comes second is Singapore, and then it's the Irish. Here we are with the greatest harm, the greatest gambling losses, and it's the Northern Territory Racing and Wagering Commission, three of who are openly admitting their conflicts of interest and that they're part of the gambling industry who are, quote, quote, regulating. So that was the story today.
And so it may or may not be a coincidence, given the backgrounds of the people on the regulator, that gambling continues to operate the way that it does in this country. Can you paint us a picture of the status quo? What does gambling look like in Australia at the moment?
So when I initially convinced my brother to have the first productivity commission into gambling, 1999, I was staggered. I had no idea. When I found that 20% of all the pokies in the world were in Australia. Later updated to show that 75% of all the world's pokies in pubs and clubs are in Australia. 75% of all the world's pokies in pubs and clubs are in Australia. Most pokies in the rest of the world are in casinos, which is a different form of gambling. It's destination. You've got to get to Las Vegas. You intend to gamble. You need to get home. Because they're in every fourth or fifth block, 75% of the world's in pubs and clubs, you weren't intending to gamble. You were going shopping. You have an extra half an hour on your parking meter. There's always a pub or club that's open. You suddenly think, oh, I can go and play the pokies. So the Productivity Commission, 1999, my brother's work, and I give him full credit for that, saw John Howard say, I am ashamed. But then he added, but it's a matter for the states. And the states basically said, we're not giving up our revenue. The history is fascinating. You know, the only two places in the world in 1955 that had legal poker machines were Las Vegas, run by the mafia, and Sydney. And in Sydney at that time, they weren't as damaging as we know now. You put 2 bob in, 2 shillings, remember that? You pulled a one-arm bandit. You could not do heavy losses. The New South Wales government, both sides of politics, said, wow, we can pay for greenfield suburban developments, particularly in Western Sydney, through just in our planning, giving a license to pokies venues in clubs to open up. We don't have to have other community sport recreation facilities. We can just say we've opened a pokies club. Why does Western Sydney have the greatest pokies infestation, the greatest losses, transfer from the richest to the poorest? Because it was part of the planning code. We will just open up Western City, and then it was other areas, by giving a pokies venue. What then happened, and it was under Bob Carr, I'm sad to say, I like Bob Carr on a lot of issues, but under Bob Carr, he was convinced by a backbencher in his party, who was formerly president of the AHA, let the pokies in clubs go into pubs. And it was Bob Carr who saw the dollars in Treasury, New South Wales Treasury, rolling in. If you then expanded pokies from clubs, technically not-for-profits, we can get to that, but let pubs have them. So New South Wales, and you're sort of part of it, has 35% of all the world's pokies in pubs and clubs. You have here Labor-run, union-run pokies clubs in Canberra. You have the Randwick Labor Club in New South Wales. If you ask why a New South Wales Labor Party will never reform pokies, the answer is very simple. They're the only party in the Western world, the democratic Western world, that has pokies interests. $120 million of pokies interest tied up in the Labor Party. I've quite forgotten what your question was now, Alice. Where was I?
You were painting a picture of the status quo.
Oh, the status quo. So when Rudd was in opposition, asked me, what should I do about gambling? I said, renew the Productivity Commission. My brother's was 1999. Rudd commissioned it. It came down the day before Gillard replaced Rudd. It showed that gambling losses in Australia had soared. They were worse. We were actually having the greatest harm, but it all got lost because the story was Gillard becoming Prime Minister. Gillard then could not form a government without Andrew Wilkie's vote. Remember this? Andrew Wilkie said the Productivity Commission recommended either a mandatory pre-commitment card, we call that a cashless card today, where you lock in your losses and lock yourself out once you've hit your losses before you're in front of the hypnotising machines. A great reform. So Gillard announced the mandatory pre-commitment card. When she tried to implement it, the Heat New South Wales clubs and AHA and the clubs here brought on Labor backbenchers was so acerbic and searing that Gillard rang me as Prime Minister in tears saying, I've got to back down, Tim. New South Wales and Queensland backbenchers have marched into my office. They've said if I do not pull this cashless card on pokies, they're going to vote for Rudd. My prime ministership is over. I said, what are you going to do? She said, I've got a plan. I've got to get Peter Slipper to change sides from the Liberals. I've got to offer him the Speaker's chair to have the numbers in case Wilkie says, cuts up rough. We got Peter Slipper, always an exploding cigar, as Speaker of the House because of pokies. That's how it happened. Gillard had to vote. When Peter Garrett and I were going to the Rabbitohs to debate Alan Jones because of Gillard's reform, federal police rang us both. They said, Clubs New South Wales have so stirred up hatred and vitriol, you are at risk. You cannot go. We cannot protect you. Garrett and I had to pull out. That's what Alan Jones, Telegraph, all those New South Wales clubs, AHA, pokies. The untold story of how pokies has continued to ghost politics in Australia is extraordinary.
Thank you for such a accurate, albeit terrifying, picture of pokies in Australian politics. Malcolm, a couple of times Tim has mentioned, for example, the commission being in the Northern Territory because of tax conditions and the relationship between tax and gambling. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that relationship?
The two levels of government are both responsible for tax. They obviously rake in a lot of money, but
just close.
I'm on just close,
yeah.
Right. But actually, what I wanted to open with doing is selling you all on my tax policy. Everyone's giving you tax policies these days. So here's what I propose. You probably know we pay a 2% surcharge on our Medicare levy, just added to our income tax rates. I'm going to propose a 3% surcharge, 3% extra income tax we all pay, all Australians. I'm not seeing any hands go up. Okay, you're probably thinking, well, okay, if it goes to the hospitals, maybe we should pay more tax if it helps fix our problem with hospitals. No. We're not going to give it to the hospitals as public revenue. We're going to give it to the private sector. Just hand it all over to corporations. Still not seeing any hands go up. Okay, maybe there are some economists who think that would be good for the economy, more money circulating in the economy, the health of the private sector. Actually, 2/3 of it would go overseas because it's in multinational corporations that own a lot of the gambling interests in Australia. I'm still not seeing too many takers for this tax policy. It would also cause problems of addiction and damage to your psychiatric situation, mental health harms, probably the breakdown of your relationship, in addition to all those financial things. 3% tax on everybody. And you're 3 times likely to have domestic violence in your household. Still no takers. Oh, and probably associated with 20% of the suicides in our community. I've not described a new tax policy. I've described the situation that exists now. We should not accept the default scenario for regulation gambling we now have. Leaving that situation alone is a policy choice by governments and by the politicians we've elected in the past and are about to elect, and we should urge them to do differently. 3%. I got the 3% figure largely based on the situation in Western Sydney. And look, it's wobbly as hell. The excellent data elves of the Australia Institute may be able to do better. And it's also true that that's an average. And gambling is not spread equally. About 30% of us engage in no form of gambling, but there are some households where that tax rate would be more than 100% of that household's taxable income. So that is what is really going on. Do you want my tax policy?
And just while we're on the topic of tax, did you know that if you bet on the winner of the Miles Franklin Literary Prize, your windfall is tax-free? But if you win the Miles Franklin Literary Prize, you pay tax. So my tax policy, make sure that more writers win more prizes, and then we could collect more tax. Tim, talk to us about the so-called Murphy Review that's been known as the Murphy Review after the late Peter Murphy, Labor MP, who was chair of the inquiry into gambling. Its official name is You Win Some, You Lose More. Maybe a modest name, really. What were some of the key findings and recommendations you would draw out of that?
So Peter Murphy lost her battle with cancer at the age of 50. I was at her 50th birthday party 6 weeks before she died. But she had done an extraordinary job. She had 2 other Labor members who absolutely were in consensus with her recommendations. 2 Liberal members, Keith Wallahan and Jenny Ware. Kate Cheney, a Teal, Pat Conahan, a National. It was the first time I can remember a multi-partisan, unanimous set of recommendations, 31 of them. The big 3, a phased in over 3 years ban of gambling ads. 4 European nations have done this. We have, as I said, 1 million a year on free-to-air TV, let alone social media. And the magnificent work of the Australian Institute was finding that 1 in 3 12 to 17-year-old teenagers is gambling. It's meant to be illegal. There's meant to be age verification. The sports betting companies don't care about age verification if they're winning. They care about it if they're losing. That's when they then start testing what your age was. You know, many of us have seen the Netflix Adolescence. Have you seen that? There is the parents of a 13-year-old murderer. And it's a powerful line saying, we thought he was safe. We thought he was up in his room. We didn't know he was on his computer and his social media and incel and all those. We thought he was safe. Parents believe their kids are safe, but 1 in 3 12 to 17-year-olds is gambling in Australia. And that was magnificent research by the Australian Institute.
Yeah, my colleague Morgan Harrington, who was looking after that project, is in here somewhere. One of the interesting things about that was that there are more people in that age bracket who are gambling online than playing soccer, the most popular sport for that age group. That's how big the problem is.
It's extraordinary. And when we say why, because AFL and NRL and Cricket Australia, though it has less ads, has literally said you don't watch sport without gambling. The mainstreaming normalising that to watch sport is to gamble. Once we had Benson and Hedges cricket, and we had AFL Foster's grand final. We said, hang on, they're legal products, but they're adult products. We should not be grooming kids. We have not applied that. You know, in the 6 o'clock commercial news, you can watch, you can't have a you can't have a alcohol or a cigarette tobacco ad. No problem having gambling ads. So the first recommendation of the Murphy report was to ban gambling ads. 4 European nations have done it. The second recommendation of the biggest ones was a national regulator. No longer the Northern Territory Wagering and Racing Commission, conflicted and hopeless, with what was extraordinary, the Minister for Racing in the Northern Territory, who actually appoints the members, being asked, do you take freebies from Sportsbet, Tabroke? She said, oh yes, of course. Absolutely no shame. Simply no shame. The third recommendation was we treat gambling as a health issue. Why a health issue? Because where there's gambling in the family, there's 3 times more domestic violence. Why did the Prime Minister's own domestic violence advisory committee last September recommend a full gambling ad ban? Because the link between gambling and domestic violence is so devastating. A health issue because of the mental health, because 63 cents in every dollar going through a poker machine comes from someone addicted. That's the Productivity Commission report. That's why a cashless card, which I was talking about earlier, is you set your limits before you're in front of the hypnotizing machine where you lose all track of time. The only group in Australia against responsible gambling is the gambling industry. Their business model is profoundly built on it. Because of the grooming, the health issue, because of the grooming of kids. 85% of 10-year-olds now, when they watch AFL, NRL, know the logos, the odds, the jingles of sports betting companies. And just to give one feature of the iniquity of this, Bet365, heard of them? Registered in the Northern Territory, monitored, regulated by the Northern Territory Racing and Wagering Commission. The CEO, Denise Coates, based in London, her salary this year was £94 million plus $66 million in dividends. Sportsbet, another one registered in the Northern Territory. Yeah, you heard right, £94 million, the highest paid CEO in Britain. Sportsbet, that takes $2.2 billion out of Australia each year, does not have one shop, one outlet. It is all gambling ads. And when I saw the Prime Minister the day before the AFL Grand Final and was trying to explain this to him, it was depressing. It was so depressing. He kept saying, oh no, Tim, lotteries are what do the damage. I said, that's Peter Vlandius's line. He said, oh, don't say that. He said, pokies don't advertise. I said, they're on every 4th block. They don't need to advertise. We've got 75% of them in pubs and clubs of the world's pokies. I'm not sure about that. I said, Sportsbet takes out $2.2 billion. That's just one of the 36. And it doesn't have one shop or outlet. Albo had, the conversation had begun with Albo saying to me, I'd played tennis this morning, I love my tennis. It was so depressing, so underwhelming, my discussion with him. I gave him a book that I wrote in 2000 on gambling. He goes, oh, have you written a book? I said, yes. Will you read it? It was clear to me he hadn't read the Murphy report. He had not even read it. His chief of staff sitting in that meeting looked utterly embarrassed. Albo told me he'd played tennis that morning in Melbourne. I said, it was so bad. Our conversation finished this way. I said, you know, Albert, I love my tennis. I play once, twice a week. I challenge you to a tennis match. If I win, we do Peter Murphy and her recommendations. If you win, you can do Peter V'landys, who you've been quoting. Oh, Tim, I'm going to do an elbow. When I told my Alliance for Gambling Reform how it ended, they said, so all our campaigning comes down to how good you are at tennis, Tim. But that's the Murphy report.
Thank you. Malcolm, we've been speaking a bit about the bigger picture. Can you talk to us a bit more about on an individual level? And we've heard about domestic violence and losses. What kinds of impacts does gambling have on individual people's lives?
Mental health is a big one. Domestic violence is serious. We've listed them, but I want to say a word about addiction as the mediator of this very problem and why this is a public health issue and not some sort of free choice issue. Because you'll hear a lot of stuff, almost all of it having its origin in the gambling industry, about how freedom of choice is the thing. People should exercise their freedom, their own responsibility to gamble or not gamble. But the industry is not interested in those of us who have one or two flutters. 63%, as you say, of the income comes from that small proportion of people who are heavily addicted. This industry would not be doing this were it not for addiction as its mechanism of making most of its money. Addiction is not some nice thing that happens to our brains. It is damaging to our brains, damaging psychiatrically, associated with other forms of addictions, lots of evidence about association with alcohol dependency, some lesser evidence about association with various other addictions. But once a brain becomes trained to be addicted to one thing, it is more vulnerable to other forms of habitual addiction. This is a health issue. I know it's not as if you're consuming a food or drink to get to this condition, but it is affecting our bodies. It is a health issue, which is why my mob are interested in it. People often ask, why is the public health community interested in gambling? Tim has mentioned it. And the propagation sideways to other forms of immediate harm, health harms, is added to by the deprivation of your wealth, which leaves you less able to deal with all other events in life, including defend yourself against health problems. And it becomes a social wealth and income protection kind of problem once you've started losing all this money. So don't believe the nonsense about how we should all exercise our freedom and responsibility to turn off our addiction today. Any of you in the room who've had friends or family who are in a state of serious addiction know that there is no freedom of choice. Freedom of choice has been taken away from a person who has been made addicted. And I say made addicted, it didn't drift in through the window. It is deliberately engineered by an industry using high-grade psychological methods and research to make us all addicted to coming back to that poker machine or staying up in our room gambling. And yes, they attack kids. Attack's the right word. They are trying to get children habituated to the psychological behavioural patterns that are gambling at a young age. And all of this is mediated by their advertising, which is why advertising is such an important part. Tim said it was one of the 3 big recommendations of that report. Without advertising, people would not be taking it up at this rate. So attacking this issue at the level of advertising is important. I'm sure I've rambled from your question, but...
Thank you. We will have time for audience questions. We have a microphone over to the side here. So if you would like to come and line up while I ask a final question of Tim before we go to audience questions, which is, can you talk to us about the politics of this situation? This seems to be a very popular policy. There's support, as you mentioned, a productivity commission when your brother was treasurer. We have the Murphy Review. Why is it that we haven't seen a political solution to this problem so far?
Because of the power of the vested interests. So we have 80% public support for a ban on gambling ads. Normally, the democratic equation goes, well, if 80% of the public want something, the politicians will lick their finger, say, which way is the wind blowing? I must go that way because that's where the wind's blowing. Not here. And it's because the vested interests, who are 7, 9, 10 and Foxtel, have said with the AFL, NRL, and then the sports betting companies who donate generously to both sides, have said, don't you dare. I find this particularly disturbing. I was at Peter Murphy's funeral. The Prime Minister spoke very movingly. He even singled out her land-breaking inquiry, the Murphy report, and said, we will be responding. That was 21 months ago, and he's refused to respond. Dutton, before the Peter Murphy report, to his credit, in his budget reply last year, the year before it might have been, I'm getting mixed up, said, we will ban ads an hour before, during the game, and an hour after. He actually went a bit further before the Murphy report, but Dutton has not responded. The reason that neither have responded, though there is people in both parties who are deeply ashamed, who actually want to honour Peter Murphy, is because of the power of the vested interests. The extraordinary hold was sort of highlighted today in a Reuters report written by Americans, but you can find it, and I can send it to you if you can't find it today. It showed that since the Murphy inquiry was called, $245,000 in free gifts has gone to our federal politicians from the sports betting companies, mainly in the form of tickets. 29,000 to the Prime Minister, 21,000 to Peter Dutton. Now, it's not just the free tickets and the excitement. It's what's really powerful is that when you take the ticket, you have the sports betting company in your ear through the whole duration of a game, 2 or 3 hours with the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition. I don't get that access. My one meeting with Albo the day before the grand final last year was to tick off that he had met with me. It was sort of extraordinary. He said, oh, I understand you're upset about something I said about you in Question Time, Tim, but I never named you. He said in Question Time, Tim Costello wants all gambling banned. I've never been a prohibitionist. I've never said it's a legal adult product. I've said we want the ads banned. We want the Murphy report. Albo added, but Tim, I didn't name you. I said, yes, you did. No, I didn't name you in Question Time. His Chief of Staff, David Epstein, says, yes, you did, Prime Minister. The whole thing was incredibly embarrassing. I'm with a Prime Minister, and it's this embarrassing. Repeating Peter Vlandius's lines. Well, the power of the vested interests mean, and you know about this, with other vested interests, name them. Fossil fuels, they line up. The power of the vested interests is why when this is so popular, when parents have a psychic vomit when they watch another gambling ad on TV with the AFL and NRL, and neither party will move. That's what's going on.
All right, first question.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Penny. This is following on from what you said, really. I'm wondering, what can we do as Joe Public to get the ads banned as a starter? If the PM was handed the report from the Murphy report and doesn't do anything, if the Labor Party is so tied to the income from the pokies and other forms of gambling, what can we do to force the government, and if the Liberals get in, to ban these ads? What power? And I mean, writing letters and all that, it doesn't seem to. If the report doesn't do anything, we can vote against. I mean, I declare here I've always been a Labor voter, but I'm really disappointed that he didn't follow through with that.
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you for asking it. So to distinguish, pokies are a state jurisdiction. That's the Minns government. The gambling ads and a national regulator are a federal jurisdiction. Michelle Rowland, who unfortunately took 20,000 from Sportsbet for her re-election last election, then had lavish birthday party paid for by sports betting. I mean, yeah, and I've done media on it. I mean, you know, we're in a time of shamelessness. Have you noticed that malignant narcissist with a bad haircut in America? We are in a time of utter shamelessness, and it is true also here in Australia. So, two different jurisdictions. Look, I shouldn't be political, but what can you do? Vote for David Pocock. Vote for Teals. We can only get gambling reform with minority government. The majors will not budge. They are so utterly captured. The other thing to do is just to keep in the ear of your federal member. I know Andrew Lee here, who I think is a very fine person, has a very bad conscience about this issue. He really does. I believe that Claire, the member for Canberra, Alicia Payne, has a very bad conscience about this. There are a number of Labor people who really feel deeply ashamed. Julian Hill, yes. Oh, good. Yeah, I've texted Julian today, actually. Oh, Peter Murphy. At Peter Murphy's 50th birthday party, there was Mark Dreyfus, there was Tanya Plibersek, Julian Hill, Josh Burns, the Labor list goes on and on. The gaming minister for Victoria, Melissa, who was a good woman, gave a speech saying, Peter stood up on gambling. I've got more to do at state level, and Tim Costello's here tonight. We've got more together. The whole room erupted in applause. There's a lot of Labor people who have very, very bad consciences about this. Apart from anything else, most of the pokies, if we're talking at state level, are in the Labor electorates. Overlay a piece of, what do you call that, tracing paper? Overlay that with the poorest postcodes and where the most pokies are, and they're all Labor electorates. It's a ruthless transfer of money from the poorest to the captains of gaming industry. These CEOs of not-for-profit pokies clubs are paid more than the Prime Minister. They are building gold-plated bathrooms with indoor rainforests. The whole thing is completely obscene. Artificial indoor rainforests. When it comes to sports betting, now 18 to 24-year-old men, 1 in 4 is addicted on Labor's watch. What Albo will always say is, we have done more on gaming reform than any other government. Unfortunately, it's just not true. BetStop, brought in by Labor, started under the Libs. They implemented it, but it had technical problems. Credit betting, we have got rid of credit betting, started with Andrew Wallace, a Liberal House of Reps member, brought in eventually by Labor. I have to say, I worked really well with Anna Bligh of the Australian Banking Association. She was a person of conviction to get credit betting banned. Credit betting is gambling with someone else's money. That's what it was. Credit, that's all credit is. Getting rid of gamble responsibly, to be careful, what are you betting with? All those ads started under the Libs. Labor finally implemented it, but it started under the Libs. When Albo says we've done more, unfortunately, you've got to laugh. Because Albo's closeness to Peter V'landys, why did NRL last year and this year have its first round in Las Vegas? Only for one thing, for the gambling dollar. The NRL, $60 million from gambling, is now a gambling company with a subsidiary in football. Same with the AFL. Albo is totally captured by them. I believe Michelle Rowlands, who I've been very critical of, actually put to Cabinet recommendations for a ban online, not on free-to-air, and I would have supported that. There was only one person who struck it down, it was Albo. Albo struck it down because of his closeness. Now, Michelle Rowland hasn't confirmed that to me, but I actually believe that's what happened.
The Australia Institute, as a non-partisan research institute, obviously has no position on who you vote for, but we're very excited that you all have the opportunity to go vote on May 3. Malcolm, did you want to come in?
I'll just add about the political process. It remains important to get the Liberal and Labor parties to shift. We have this sort of one moment every 3 years of influence, but there's really, if all of us make sure that these issues are top of mind, and when we interact with politicians in whatever opportunities we have, and Tim and I have more opportunities in our job roles, and we convince them that these are top of mind issues, I'm sure you're quite right that there are a large number of people in the Labor backbench, and to be fair, the Liberal backbench and all the front benches, who have issues of conscience with what's going on. And they look around going, how do we break up the situation we've become enmeshed in? What's going on here? How do we end up in this situation? It's not as if we have to shift public support from these reforms from 30% to 80%. It's already at 80%. So the democratic process is failing. And the reason it's failing, as Tim has said, is corporate influence. And in addition to the regulatory changes which should be made, which were prepared by Rowland's department for her, they have done the work on how to respond to that bipartisan report. We know what to do in that. We also must reform the system of lobbying, to some extent political donations. Frankly, the sums of money in political donations are not enormous. The way they influence politics is by threatening them rather than giving them a pile of cash or threatening not to give them a pile of cash. There are other ways the industry frightens government. So we need reforms to our systems of democracy and government and lobbying and the other aspects of this that will protect our politicians. Let's be nice about politicians for once. They're meant to be our representatives doing what 80% of us want, etc. Protect those people from that influence, because what's been going on so far simply isn't working. We need to change the nature of the way politics works, not just study the science of addiction.
Next question.
My name's Greg Adamson. I'm from Griffith in New South Wales. I ran in a recent state election as a candidate, as an independent, and the issue of gambling came up and was quite a vicious topic which took place, the argument which took place. My concern and what I'm asking really is more advice. If I'm in an environment where regional journalism is requiring the support that's coming from the gambling lobby, and we don't have the investigative journalism that's taking place, is it in my community's interest to be advocating against the gambling, particularly when our social infrastructure is built on these limited facilities that house it? And I'm caught in a conflict of interest. Like, do I step up to speak, or how would you suggest to handle the situation?
So let's separate the state and federal issues. At federal level, the argument run out by Bill Shorten about why they hadn't responded to the Murphy report was regional TV. You might remember. When we pressed Michelle Rowland's office, how much are we talking about? It was $27 million. We're talking about a $32 billion industry, more than aged care, more than NDIS in losses. That's losses. And $27 million. What Malcolm said before was right. It's not the donations particularly, it's the threat. Kerry Stokes, the Murdochs at Foxtel, 9, 7 and 10, well, Stokes is 7, all threatened to turn on Labor and the opposition if they brought in the Murphy inquiry gambling ad ban. Kerry Stokes, his net wealth means that his ownership of Channel 7, which has the AFL gambling ads, his net wealth is so great that his ownership of Channel 7 is less than 1% of his net wealth. Kerry Stokes can wear their part of the 27 million. The Murdochs are worth $30 billion. They can wear some of that 27 million regional.
May I just ask, so particularly in my mind, it comes to the Australian Country Media Group, who have a large presence, the newspaper. and they're the ones that are going to be probably significantly impacted by a decline in revenue that would come through with it. And I'm wondering, is there other avenues that we could support our regional journalists?
We're talking about $27 million.
Is that total?
Yeah, that's the figure. When we press them, how much, is regional dependent on these gambling ads? It was $27 million. That's what we're talking about. And Australia-wide, that's what we're talking about. And that was a figure that I thought was unbelievable, because I assumed it must be huge. Nick Xenophon, a friend of mine, when he was there, tried to get an extra levy and pay for regional media, and I think that's a legitimate issue. But we're talking about so little money. And the Murphy report addressed that. The Murphy report said you can put a levy, going back to Malcolm's levy, on the sports, the gambling sports bookies to actually pay for this. It actually floated a levy. If we're talking now about pokies and regional pokies saying, oh, but we give so much back in community benefit, they give very little back. It's tiny. It's embarrassing. It's ridiculous. And it's a rort. So regional Australia, I know, is often used as the reason, but I think it's a complete straw man.
Could I just add, how about we regulate so that a company cannot simultaneously be a media company and have gambling interests? Last year, my organisation, in a fit of frustration, proposed a 1% tax on that whole 25 billion of loss. Or was it the total turnover? I can't remember.
32 billion.
But a 1% tax on gambling profit in order to buy off the sports sector from its association with the gambling industry, to get them off the political prime minister's back and sort of break up these forces of influence based on the money. We don't need to tax ourselves for 3%, just tax them 1%, and we have some money to actually start addressing, whether it's buying off the sports industry or giving stuff to local community clubs so they don't have to be trapped in a dependency on a little bit of money coming out of the local pokies or whatever, and change the underlying economic realities that these guys are exploiting so efficiently to make stratospheric amounts of money out of simple things that we can break up if our politicians and governments have the courage to do these things. And if they propose what I just said, the industry will scream, so what? We need politicians who are prepared to say, so what? And make the changes to unblock the trap you were in.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi. It's so hard to stop looking, and you see it everywhere. All this advertising, stadiums were named after betting companies. Even on Reddit, there's a feature where you can disable gambling or alcohol advertising, yet you still get it. How do they get through that block feature? If pretty horrible question, wording, sorry.
I don't know the answer to your question about the technology of that, but I would stress that advertising is the key to a lot of this. Yeah, it would be nice if we changed the actual on-the-ground rules about the incidence of gambling, but advertising is how they attract the next generation of customers, typically very young people. The advertising is not marketed at 55 and 75-year-olds, it's marketed to try and attract 15-year-olds. So I'd attack the problem of gambling through advertising first and strongest. And all these self-exclusion things, yeah, they don't seem to work. The New South Wales government is buggering around, quite frankly, with a policy about facial recognition for people who go into clubs so that they can identify the 1% of problem gamblers. What they're really trying to do is collect data on the next 10% so that they can send them more incentives, and I'll exclude the 1% for a day, and then they get all this data. All those games are being played because we're not good enough at having the public interest to direct those regulatory battles. My advice is to the public health sector, don't go to the meetings to discuss this bloody facial recognition technology. It's a scam to waste 5 years of your advocacy responding to an industry effort. Just ban the bloody thing. And what we need is politicians willing to actually serve the public interest.
They seem fine with excising alcohol and tobacco, but not
That's the point.
Sorry,
Yeah.
those things took decades.
It,
We're-
it takes decades. I've been at this 30 years, so I'm
gotta keep going.
My kid said to me some years ago over the dinner table, "Dad, is there any campaign you've backed that's ever won?" And I realised my kids thought I was a loser. 4 European nations have banned the gambling ads, and the argument that you'll hear elbow running out, which is Peter V'landis's line, "Oh, if you ban them, it'll go off to offshore, to illegals." It hasn't happened in those 4 European nations. This argument, when it comes to pokies reform, I love this. The cashless card, which is what we want brought in. Facial recognition is just being pushed by the industry so they can market pokies people recognizing that's what they're doing, facial recognition. The cashless card, it's difficult. Min's had to have a trial. He turned the trial into do the punters like it? The trial was never about do the punters like it. It was actually to iron out the technology. Who did the pokies with a cashless card in 2017 in Norway? Who did it? And it's been working brilliantly. Aristocrat. Aristocrat is the Australian ex-pokies export. So Len Ainsworth is the only billionaire in Australia from pokies alone. And his machines are the state of the art. That's why he's a multi-billionaire. It's worth 90 billion. Len Ainsworth's Aristocrat is worth far more than Qantas. We don't understand this. It is extraordinary. Len Aristocrat's company actually brought in the cashless card in Norway. All this trial stuff that people go on about, or it's going to go offshore, is just the gambling industry's lines.
Thank you. Next question. And I think this will be our last question. We're about to run out of time.
Hello. The pokies industry has its own problems with complying with some of the laws. For example, I think back in the 2010s, you had Troy Stoll say that 95% of pokies lobbies in New South Wales didn't comply with anti-money laundering restrictions. And as thanks, he ended up being dragged through a bunch of legal cases, which cost him heavily. So my question is, what kind of legal protections can we put in place for whistleblowers within the pokies industry to assist in reform?
Troy Stolz is one of the bravest men I know. He worked for 25 years for Clubs New South Wales. He watched their lies. He watched the deceit. He watched the lobbying and owning of politicians, and he blew the whistle. He blew the whistle on how all their responsible gambling programs that they'd sold to the New South Wales government were utter BS. Troy, for blowing the whistle, got sued, nearly lost everything. Thankfully, there was a settlement. My friend Nick Xenophon acted for him. The whistleblower legislation, you know a lot about this in Canberra, you've had a few high-profile cases, is incredibly important when you have these powerful vested interests who sue you or sign NDAs that say you can never speak once you've left, is actually defeating public interest. And Troy is a hero.
And I'd just add, I agree with all that. If the laws we do get made are to be actually enforced properly, we're going to need a few public servants. The 6 in the Northern Territory, and they're going to have to be people in a position of successful independence, adequate resource to carry out the regulation that you pointed out. It wasn't going so well in New South Wales. New South Wales is famous for things not going so well. But we can't just trust people to self-regulate. Self-regulation is a joke phrase, by the way, and everything to do with public health. So we are going to need to make sure that the regulatory models we put in place are backed by public interest serving public servant staff who can do the job properly. Otherwise, we won't achieve even what we have talked the politicians into passing.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much for coming along, everyone. Please join me in thanking Tim and Malcolm. Thank you, Verity Lane, for hosting us, and to the Australia Institute staff for making the magic happen. If you haven't seen already, the Australia Institute has a daily blog during the election campaign at the moment. It's everything that you need to know in the day's politics. You can find it on our website. Amy Ramikis is also very funny, which helps us survive the election campaign. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you next month.